Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Ancient Epics, the place where the greatest stories of humanity come back to life. In the autumn of 1769, in a quiet Dutch village curled like a sleeping cat beneath the purple heights of the Catskill Mountains, a simple farmer named Rip Van Winkle walked into the forest with his dog and his gun to escape. For just one afternoon, the endless storm of his wife's tongue. He never came home that night, nor the next, nor for 20 long years that saw kings dethroned, colonies rebel against an empire, and a new nation rise from the smoke of war. When at last he wandered back into the village, his beard flowed white as hoarfrost, his musket was a tube of rust, and the portrait of King George that once hung above the inn had been replaced by a stern-faced stranger called General Washington. One man, one ordinary man, slept through the entire American Revolution. How could flesh and blood lie motionless while the world tore itself apart and stitched itself anew? What unseen hand poured the draught of oblivion into his cup? Tonight, beneath the quiet flicker of firelight, let us climb those haunted slopes together, and listen for the far-off thunder of ninepins that still rolls across the Catskills when autumn winds awaken. Long before the first Dutch keel cut the waters of the Hudson, the mountains bore the name Cotterkill, the Wildcat Creek. In the tongue of the Mohican who hunted deer along their ridges and gathered huckleberries in the high hollows. To the Lenape farther south, they were simply the place where the sky touches earth. For on certain evenings the clouds gathered so low around the summits that it seemed the spirits of the air held council there. When Henry Hudson and his crew of Dutch and English sailors sailed past in the half-moon in 1609, they saw the same violet wall rising from the river and wrote in their log that these heights appeared like the Spanish Alps, only clothed in endless forest. 160 years later, small stone houses with stepped gables and diamond-paned windows still clustered at the mountain's foot, their hearths burning apple wood that perfumed the autumn dusk with sweetness. The village that Washington Irving would immortalize lay on the western bank where the Catskill Creek spills into the Hudson, a place of orchards heavy with red-streaked pippin apples and fields of golden rye bending before the river wind. Rip Van Winkle belonged to one of the old families that had come with the last Dutch governor, the gallant, wooden-legged Peter Stuyvesant. His ancestors had stood on the ramparts of New Amsterdam when the English ships appeared, and they had stayed when the city became New York, stubbornly speaking Dutch, baking a lycoex at New Year, and keeping the feast of St. Nicholas long after the English calendar had swept the saints away. Yet Rip inherited none of his forefathers' iron will. He was a kind soul, slow to anger, quick to laughter, the sort of man who would spend an entire day helping a neighbor dig a well, yet let his own fence fall into ruin. Children adored him. He carved them whistles from elder stems and told them tales of the river spirit who wore a crown of river mist. His dog Wolf, a shaggy creature with one ear torn by a bear, followed him everywhere, and together they were as constant a sight as the great sycamore that spread its mottled arms over the village inn. The inn itself was a low building of blue limestone quarried from the mountains, its signboard painted with the rosy face of King George III in a gilded frame. There, every evening, the men of the village gathered on a long bench beneath the tree. Nicholas Vedder, the landlord, sat at the door from morning till night, his only motion the slow tilting of his head to follow the sun, while the curling smoke from his pipe measured time more truly than any clock. Beside him perched the schoolmaster Derrick Van Bummel, who could argue politics from dawn to dusk, and Bram Dutcher, a burly farmer with a voice like a bull. They spoke of the price of wheat, of trouble brewing in Boston, of the Stamp Act and the quartering of soldiers, though to Rip these matters were as distant as the moon. He preferred to lean against the tree trunk, filling the air with the soft scent of Virginia tobacco while Wolf slept across his feet. Dame Van Winkle, sharp as winter wind, declared that her husband's idleness would bring them all to the poorhouse. Her voice could be heard clear across the village green when Rip lingered too long at the inn, and the children would scatter like quail at her approach. Yet even she, in quieter moments, admitted that Rip's heart was gold. He would give his last crumb to a beggar and carry water for widows without being asked. Still, a farm demands toil, and the Van Winkle land slid steadily into thistle and goldenrod while Rip dreamed away the afternoons fishing for perch that he usually released again, or hunting squirrels he seldom brought home. On the day that changed everything, the sky was a bowl of polished brass and the maples blazed like torches along the cliffs. Rip had promised to mend the stone wall at the lower pasture, but the shouting at breakfast had been fiercer than usual, and by noon he found himself climbing higher than he intended, following an old bear trail that switched back through groves of hemlock, whose trunks rose straight and dark as the pillars of some primeval temple. Sunlight slanted through the needles in dusty golden bars, and the air carried the sweet resinous breath of the forest. Higher still, he passed outcrops of the red sandstone that geologists now call the Catskill Delta, laid down 400 million years ago, when a vast river system emptied into a shallow sea that once covered all of New York. Ripple marks and the fossilized tracks of ancient amphibians still hide in those stones, waiting for sharp-eyed hikers to discover them even today. At last Rip emerged into a natural amphitheater, a green bowl ringed by crags where ravens wheeled and called. Evening was gathering, though the sun had not yet set, and a strange hush lay over the place. There, upon a grassy knoll, he saw them, 9 small figures in the dress of old Holland, jerkin and hose, sugar-loaf hats, and long clay pipes clenched in their teeth. Their faces were broad and solemn, their beards trimmed square in the fashion of the 17th century. They played at ninepins with balls that rumbled like thunder, and every time a pin fell the sound rolled down the valley and shook the leaves on distant trees. Rip recognized the captain at once, though he could not have said how. A stout little man in a laced doublet and a feather in his hat, bearing the very look of the old paintings of Henry Hudson that hung in the manor houses along the river. Fear and wonder warred in Rip's breast, but the little captain beckoned with grave courtesy, and Rip, ever obedient to kindness, stepped forward. A flagon was pressed into his hand, carved from some dark wood and brimming with a liquor that gleamed like liquid topaz. It smelled of juniper and something older, wilder, like the breath of the mountain itself. One swallow, and warmth spread through his veins like honeyed fire. A second, and the world softened at the edges. The ninepins clattered on, the little man moved in stately silence, and the sun slipped behind the west. Rip's knees buckled gently. He sank onto a bed of moss older than nations. Wolf curled beside him with a sigh, and the deepest sleep known to mortal man folded him in its arms. While Rip lay dreaming, seasons turned to years and years to decades. Snow blanketed the hollow 20 times, and 20 times the trilliums pushed through the melting drifts. The sugarloaf pine that sheltered him grew a little thicker, its roots weaving a living cradle around his body. Spring rains carried silt down the mountainside and laid it softly over his boots. Lichens, those patient marriages of algae and fungus that can survive on bare rock and measure time in centuries, spread their pale green coins across his coat. High overhead, the same constellations that had watched over Lenape hunters wheeled in their eternal dance, the Great Bear circling the North Star, Orion striding across winter skies, the Pleiades rising like a handful of diamonds flung by the hand of autumn. Below in the valley, history marched with drum and fife. Red-coated soldiers quartered in the stone houses, then rebel militia in homespun. The inn signboard was repainted again and again. First a crude likeness of General Washington, then the proud spread eagle of the new republic. Nicholas Vedder smoked his last pipe and was buried beneath the sycamore he loved. Dame Van Winkle, in a final burst of patriotic fervor during a speech by a traveling orator, burst a blood vessel and followed him to the grave. Children who once begged Rip for stories grew up married and had children of their own who never knew the kindly man with the rusty gun. When Rip awoke, the light of a June morning in 1789 struck his face like cold water. His joints creaked as he rose. His beard, once a modest brown, now flowed to his waist in a river of white. The flagon lay beside him, empty and dry as bone. Wulf's collar remained, green with age, but only scattered bones told where the faithful dog had kept watch. The mountains looked unchanged, yet when Rip staggered down the familiar path, he found the trail overgrown and new saplings where none had been. At the village edge he stopped, dumbfounded. The quiet hamlet had become a bustling, with framed houses and brick sidewalks. A pole flew a flag of stars and stripes he had never seen, and above the inn door swung a sign that read, "Union Hotel, Jonathan Doolittle, Proprietor." The crowd that gathered spoke with quick Yankee tongues, wearing trousers instead of breeches and coats without tails. When Rip asked in his old-fashioned Dutch for Nicholas Vedder or Bram Dutcher, they laughed or stared. An old woman with his own eyes pushed forward, tears starting. "Father," she cried, and Rip knew her for his daughter Judith, now a matron with gray in her hair. His son, little Rip, was a grown man with a family, and the sharp-tongued dame had been in her grave these 10 years. At first, they took him for a madman or a Tory come to stir trouble, but Peter Vanderdonk, the historian of the village, remembered the tale his grandfather told. Every 20 years the crew of Henry Hudson returned to the mountains to play at ninepins and drink new-made liquor brewed from mountain herbs and the clear water of springs that rise from deep aquifers in the Devonian shale. Those who taste it, the story went, sleep a single night that lasts a score of years. Thus, Rip was welcomed, not as a lunatic, but as living proof that the old Dutch legends still walk the earth. In the peace of his final years, Rip sat beneath the great sycamore, now larger than ever, and became the village patriarch. Children climbed into his lap to stroke his snowy beard while he told of the liquor that tasted of stars and the little man who bowled with thunder. The ancient fowling piece, patched and oiled, hung once more above the mantel as a relic. And on certain autumn evenings, when the sky burns crimson and the wind smells of cider presses and wood smoke, the old folk of Catskills still pause and listen. Far up the mountainside, faint but unmistakable, comes the low, solemn rumble of ninepins. And those who know the tale cross themselves, or touch the iron horseshoe above the door, and hurry home before the little captain lifts the flagon once more. So fades the tale of Rip Van Winkle, the gentle dreamer who stepped across 2 decades as a man step across a brook, cradled by the deep time of stone and star and rooted pine. While a nation was born in fire and a new flag unfurled beneath the same everlasting sky. If these ancient voices touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Ancient Epics and ringing the bell so you never miss the next forgotten tale. Thank you for watching.